Many car and truck buyers don't realize the impact that the banks had on the economy and how it's ruined the automotive industry. We want to talk about where we started in 2019 when we flipped the switch in 2020, and all of a sudden that turned our whole economy around. Upside down, on its head, side to side, and now we're left with people not able to go to work, not able to generate income, businesses were shutting down, but the banks were there to step in, and so was the government. The government was handing out money left, right, and center for people that couldn't fend for themselves, and then a couple years later, all of a sudden the government said, not only did we have your back, but not forever, we need that money back. Thank you very much. So what this caused was a bit of a catastrophic issue where people were forced to buy cars under extended credit. Now, before the whole switch, we had very, very low interest rates, which helped people buy, motivated people to buy their next new car. So this went on until all of a sudden the light switch flicked. Inflation rose, it went through monumental levels. People were buying boats, quads, SUVs, sports cars, their new truck, their new luxury vehicle, and sales were through the roof. But with all of that, inflation followed suit. Once inflation followed suit, then the banks got a hold of this and realized, wait a minute, we have to control this. We have to curb this environment. Well, this happened. And unfortunately, people still were continuing on their buying frenzy and were not forced. Of course, people decided to continue buying and spending, overreaching what their income actually allowed, overreaching, even in some cases wherever the banks could possibly give them. But there were some exceptions. And yes, even with regular banks having their criteria, following a set of rules when regarding credit scores and people that could not or could qualify for their next new car loan, there was always those shyster banks that always knew how to prey on those people that needed that next car. Yes, that's what is actually happening. Now, while you have all those straight and narrow banks that continue to operate under a real tight, strict mode of operation, most of that was driven by conservative approaches because they didn't want to see people default on their loans. They didn't want to see people default on their mortgages and every other credit card transactions. But unfortunately, in this last couple years, we've seen the cost of living escalate to the point where people could not afford to live. You could barely afford to eat, you could barely afford to put a roof over your head, and certainly you could barely afford to make those car payments. We've now finally seen a place where repossessions are on the rise. Yes, they've actually escalated. We are seeing defaults, delinquencies that have exceeded anything past 2019, where we were seeing record numbers of 1.7 million delinquencies per year. Now we're starting to escalate beyond that. Why? Because not just were banks willing to hand out money willy-nilly to every Tom, Dick, and Harry who needed a buck to buy their new car, but unfortunately there was always those low subprime lenders that were waiting in the backlog for people that scrambled through all the mainstream banks and couldn't get their hands on a loan to save their life. But those people were there, ready to pick up the scraps. And now there's regulators looking at some of these lenders that are hiding between the cracks, sliding between the dark spaces and living in the back alleys of society. We're offering a lot of these extremely high interest rate loans to people that were subprime and riskier buyers. Now what we're seeing is a reaction to all of this. We're seeing a lot of people losing their cars, a lot of people losing their homes, and unfortunately, you look at repossession car lots everywhere. Not only are they landing in the repossession lots, now they're finally making, once the banks are able to sell those off through auction, that's where they wind up, of course, because the banks are just trying to recoup their money. So they wind up at the auction, and you're seeing mega hundreds, if not thousands of vehicles in the repossession car lots or the auction houses where they're being flipped for pennies on the dollar. Now the banks lose, the buyers are losing. Fortunately and unfortunately, some of these people that were defaulting, after 1 year of forgiveness, they're able to kind of go back in there and apply for a new loan for another new car. So this cycle just keeps going round and round. And while the mainstream banks are finding ways to try to stay above the line and follow the straight and narrow, the reality is there's always those shady operators hiding in the back alleys and in the shadows, willing to offer up those 22, 24% interest loans to people that just really need to get their hands on a new car. One example is BMO here in Canada, where they're actually literally having to shut the doors or laying off tons of employees because those folks in that department can't operate anymore. With all the delinquencies, people walking away from their car loans just because people want to prioritize having a roof over the head rather than having that new car keys in their hand, they'd rather give this away and keep the house and the roof over their head. They'd rather keep feeding the kids and the car can actually take a back seat. And unfortunately, with that, now we're seeing rising level of delinquencies. And while unfortunately, there's a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, that can't control their own spending You can see this all over the place where people rack up credit card debts up to $100,000. They've got a mortgage that they can't make payments on, and they now have a car payment where they just paid $90,000 for a pickup truck for some odd reason. People are getting way in over their head, and now we're in a place where delinquencies are not just on the rise, they're hitting catastrophic levels because people can't control themselves, and the banks are sheer enablers. Yes, it's the banks that are a big part of what has actually gone on in the last couple years. If you go back to pre-2019, banks would take a much more conservative approach. They didn't necessarily want to see people lose their homes, so they were tightening up on who was actually able to take that loan out. Then as we got to the point where buyers are leaning on banks, car dealers are leaning on banks, and banks are bending and flexing and allowing certain expansion of the rule set that they have in place, and they were offering up loans to people that probably shouldn't have had. Then in the last couple of years, what we did see was a shift going the other way, where banks decided, you know what, we better tighten up. We're seeing this trend, and we'd rather give people more forgiveness and not walk away from their car loans. We'd rather give them a little bit of time and breathing room to make their payments. But now, unfortunately, banks are paying the price for that. So the mainstream banks that were, in fact, trying to operate under tighter tolerances are now finding themselves in hot water, having to lay people off, having to close their doors, or at least close those divisions. And lending money for cars seems to be a much more risky proposition to banks these days, and therefore they're expanding their requirements. Again, they're tightening up the tolerances to who can actually get a loan. But guess what? There's those shady backyard operators over there still willing to pick up the dirty scraps that the mainstream banks aren't willing to do. And as a result, there's still those people with the subprime borrowers that are going to operate, they're going to find those loopholes, and they're continually going to buy these cars when in fact they really probably shouldn't. And so a little word of advice, if I can offer anything, because it breaks my heart, and I've seen people go through this at a personal level where they're trying to dig themselves out of a financial crisis, and it's almost literally impossible. With interest rates of 20 to 25%, it's virtually an impossibility with the current cost of living today. That person will never get out of hock. So with that said, you definitely want to check out that video and why you should avoid buying a new car just yet, and maybe in fact, check out the used car market instead. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you all real soon. Bye-bye.